All right, so cones. Pretty basic, right? You see them everywhere. I mean, ice cream cones, those orange traffic cones, kids' toys, party hats.
Yeah.
Simple shapes. But what if I told you that if we took those simple cone shapes and pushed them to ludicrous speed, way faster than like the fastest jet you can think of, all kinds of crazy things start to happen.
Yeah, it's wild. Like at those speeds, it's not just about the shape itself anymore, but how that shape interacts with the air around it.
And that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at some really cutting-edge research from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where they're basically rewriting the book on what we thought we knew about how air flows around cones at hypersonic speeds.
Hypersonic meaning above Mach 5. So that's 5 times the speed of sound.
5 times. Imagine that.
It's hard to even wrap your head around, right? And at those speeds, it's a whole different ballgame. The air doesn't just flow smoothly around the object anymore.
So what does happen?
Things get crazy. The air gets compressed, it heats up like crazy, and you start to get these shock waves and boundary layers forming.
Okay, so this might be a good point to do a quick level set. For those who haven't spent their lives geeking out about aerodynamics, what exactly are shock waves and boundary layers?
Right, good point. So imagine a boat speeding through water. You get that V-shaped wave in front of it, right? Well, a shock wave is kind of like that, but in the air. It's this sudden, dramatic jump in pressure and temperature that happens when something moves faster than the speed of sound.
Because the air can't get out of the way fast enough.
Exactly. And it piles up in front of the object, creating this super compressed, super hot region. Now, the boundary layer is a bit different. It's this thin layer of air that's right next to the surface of the object, and it's kind of sticky. It wants to cling to the surface.
Ah, okay. So we've got these shock waves smashing into the object and this sticky boundary layer clinging on for dear life. What does that all mean for a cone screaming through the air at Mach 5 and beyond?
Well, studying this whole phenomenon is a massive challenge, which is why this research from Illinois is so important. They've used some incredibly sophisticated 3D computer simulations to really get a good look at what's going on, which is something we couldn't really do before.
So before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the research itself, let's take a second to appreciate the why behind all of this.
Yeah.
Why should we care about hypersonic airflow around cones?
I mean, it sounds pretty niche, right? But it actually has huge implications for all sorts of things. I'm talking spacecraft, re-entering the atmosphere, super high-speed aircraft, even missiles.
Basically, anything that has to move through the air at those insane velocities.
Exactly. And the fact that they're using these really advanced 3D simulations is key here. Older methods, like 2D simulations, just couldn't capture the full complexity of the airflow. It's like trying to understand a hurricane by just looking at a single slice of it. You're missing a whole dimension.
That makes sense. You need that three-dimensional perspective to really get the whole picture. Okay, so let's get back to the research itself. Who's leading this charge into the wild world of hypersonic cones?
This deep dive centers around the work of Professor Deborah Levin and her PhD student Irmak Taylan-Karpuscu from the Department of Aerospace Engineering at the Granger College of Engineering, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign.
What a mouthful. But seriously, it sounds like they're tackling some pretty heavy stuff. Can you give us a sense of just how much computing power goes into these simulations?
Oh, it's mind-blowing. They were working with the Frontera supercomputer at the Texas Advanced Computing Center, which is like a National Science Foundation-funded monster machine.
Wow. So not your average desktop PC.
Not even close. And it wasn't just the hardware either. They also used incredibly specialized software, a lot of which was actually developed by Professor Levin's former graduate students. It's clear that this is the culmination of years and years of work. To simulate all those billions of air molecules bumping around a cone at hypersonic speeds, you need that kind of power.
Which makes you wonder how earlier research, before they had these supercomputers, was even possible. What were the limitations back then, and how does this new research change our understanding?
So one big thing was the technology for actually measuring what was happening in experiments. Back in the early 2000s, the sensors just weren't good enough to give a complete picture of the airflow around the cone. Especially in 3D experiments, there were a lot of limitations.
And what about 2D simulations? Were they even remotely accurate?
Well, it's like I was saying before, you're only seeing a slice of what's really happening. The thinking based on this earlier work was that the airflow would basically form these smooth concentric rings around the cone, almost like those perfectly formed rings you see in a tree trunk.
So picture nice, neat layers of air flowing around the cone. Sounds almost logical, right? But that's not what these new 3D simulations are showing, is it?
Nope, not at all. They're finding something much more chaotic. They're seeing what they call breaks in the flow within shock layers, and this is happening for both single cones and double cones.
So instead of those smooth, concentric rings of air, there are these disruptions, these...
Instabilities, yeah. These spots where the flow gets all messed up.
And is this happening at all hypersonic speeds? Or is there a particular speed where things get really crazy?
Well, what's really interesting is that they found these flow breaks happening most prominently at Mach 16, right near the tip of the cone where the air is super compressed and dense.
And didn't they specifically run simulations at a lower Mach number to see if this was a consistent thing?
Right. They ran the same simulations at Mach 6, which is still incredibly fast, but they didn't see those same breaks, which tells us that this phenomenon is really tied to those extreme speeds. Like, it takes reaching Mach 16 for these instabilities to really kick in.
Okay, so we've got these breaks in the flow happening at Mach 16, which is mind-bogglingly fast to begin with. But I'm a visual learner. Are there any, pictures or diagrams in the paper that help us wrap our heads around this?
Oh yeah, there are some really cool visualizations in the paper. One of them shows the cone junction of a simulated flow field, and it highlights the conical shock wave, which is basically that boundary where the supersonic airflow slams into the cone.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
But what's really wild is that instead of this nice, smooth, circular shock wave, the picture shows a wavy, almost jagged line. They call it a wavy separation line, with this big discontinuity.
So the shock wave is all messed up.
Basically, yeah. It's a visual representation of those breaks in the flow that we were talking about.
Gotcha. And what are those other visualizations?
Right, so another image uses something called isosurfaces to visualize the angular velocity over a double cone. Basically, it's showing how fast the air is spinning at different points around the cone. And this image really hammers home how complex and three-dimensional the flow is. It's not just those neat concentric rings anymore.
It's much more dynamic and chaotic than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's this really cool one called cone tip density contours. And this one shows how the density of the air varies right at the tip of the cone. It's these little but significant variations in density that are a direct result of those underlying instabilities we've been talking about.
So all these visualizations are showing us is that the airflow at these hypersonic speeds is much more complex and unpredictable than we might have originally thought. But the big question for me is why? What's causing these breaks in the flow to happen?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to figure that out, the researchers dug deep into existing research and found that something called triple deck theory might be the key.
Triple deck theory. Sounds complicated.
It is a bit complicated, but basically it's a way of analyzing the stability of fluid flows in these really thin layers near a surface. It's kind of like zooming in on the very edge of the boundary layer to see how stable it is.
Okay. So they're not just observing this weird phenomenon. They're trying to really understand the fundamental mechanics behind it. And to do that, they actually went and developed a whole new code for their simulations, right?
Exactly. To make sure that what they were seeing wasn't just some quirk of the simulation method they were using, they built a second code, this one based on that triple deck theory, to simulate the problem in a completely different way.
Wow.
And guess what? They saw the same break in the flow. But here's the really interesting part.
What's that?
This new simulation showed the break happening in two very distinct chunks, 180 degrees apart from each other, around the cone. So it's like these disruptions are happening in these very specific, symmetrical locations.
It's like the cone is breathing, like these two spots pulsing on opposite sides.
It's a great analogy. And it suggests that there's this very specific instability mode that kicks in at these super high speeds.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned something called the direct simulation Monte Carlo method. Can you explain why that's such an important tool for this kind of research? What makes it better than other methods?
The thing about DSMC is that it goes down to the level of individual molecules. Instead of treating the air as a smooth, continuous fluid, it simulates trillions of individual air molecules bumping into each other. It's like a ridiculously detailed pool table with molecules instead of billiard balls. And by tracking all these collisions, they can get a super accurate picture of how the airflow behaves, especially in those extreme conditions around the cone.
So it's way more granular than the traditional computational fluid dynamics methods that just look at the air as a whole.
Right, exactly. It's like the difference between looking at a forest and actually counting every single leaf on every single tree.
Wow. So we've talked a lot about the science here, but let's connect the dots for our listeners. Why should we care about these breaks in the flow around a cone? What's the real-world impact?
Well, even though we're talking about a simple cone shape here, the findings have huge implications for anything that's going to travel at hypersonic speeds. Like, think about the nose cones of rockets, or the leading edges of hypersonic aircraft wings.
So the cone is basically a simplified model for parts of those vehicles.
Exactly. And if we don't understand how the air behaves around these shapes, we can't design them properly. We might end up with designs that are unstable, inefficient, or even dangerous at those speeds.
So it's not just about making things go fast. It's about making sure they can actually handle those speeds.
Precisely. This research gives us a much more complete understanding of what's happening in that crazy hypersonic environment, and that knowledge could lead to some truly revolutionary designs.
So to sum it all up, researchers have discovered these unexpected instabilities and breaks in the flow around cones at Mach 16. And this was only possible because of the power of these advanced 3D simulations and supercomputers.
Absolutely. And the so what is that this has the potential to completely change how we design hypersonic vehicles, making them safer, more efficient, and maybe even opening up possibilities we haven't even thought of yet.
It makes you wonder what other secrets are still hidden in the seemingly simple shapes around us, just waiting for the right tools and minds to unlock them.
That's a great point. If something as basic as a cone can still surprise us at these speeds, imagine what we might find when we start looking at more complex shapes.
That's a thought to leave our listeners with. If you want to delve deeper into this fascinating research, check out the paper titled Loss of Axial Symmetry in Hypersonic Flows Over Conical Shapes by Ermac T. Carpuscu and Deborah A. Levin. It was published in the journal Physical Review Fluids on March 7, 2025. The DOI is 10.1103 physrevfluids.10.030901.
And don't forget to check out the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Department of Aerospace Engineering and Fluid Dynamics. They're doing some truly groundbreaking work in this field.
And, of course, a huge shout-out to the Texas Advanced Computing Center for providing the supercomputing muscle behind this research. It's a testament to how important these massive computing resources are for pushing the boundaries of scientific discovery.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.
See that?